Right, so we are here with Tom Scott, Green Party candidate for the South West in the upcoming European parliamentary elections. So Tom,
Yeah.
what are your policies as an MEP and what would you like to achieve for the South West if you get elected?
Well, there's all kinds of things that I'd like to achieve. I think the most obvious thing relates to climate change and the very urgent measures that need to be taken at EU level as well as at national and local level. But the EU is an example of a kind of supranational institution that does actually have a huge impact, or can do, on how we can react quickly enough to what's happening to this world and actually do something effective about it.
So recently Caroline Lucas, a former leader of your party and I believe you're only MP, said that the Greens are the party for the young, a title that's been claimed by a number of parties. Actually.
Yes, that's right.
What is it that the Greens offer young voters in this country which other parties don't?
Well, it's interesting she said that. I actually had a look at the demographics of party membership, and she's right that we have the youngest profile demographically of any party in England, compares to an average age of Conservative Party members of 71. I think we're about 30, early 30s. So it's true in a sense that we are attracting a lot of young people, and I think what they like about us is that we are addressing the challenges that they see as the really important ones for the future. Environmental destruction, climate change, housing for many young people, and that's something which many Green politicians in this country and throughout Europe have been focusing on. Sian Berry, our co-leader, who's on the London Assembly, has done some fantastic work on that. So there's a whole range of issues, I think, that mean that young people see us as the party of the future rather than one of the dinosaur parties of the past.
Well, you say that, but Labour and the Lib Dems, among others, also focus on policy areas such as that and tend to adopt a much higher share of the...
Well, Labour, we're very pleased to see that Labour has a habit of stealing green policies. Sorry, perhaps that's a rude way of putting it. Borrowing them, let's say. But, for example, the Green New Deal, which some Labour politicians are now talking about, is essentially a green policy that we've been talking about for years. The basic income is another example of something that the Greens really kind of introduced into the political conversation and which has now become quite a kind of central part of Labour thinking. And we see, imitation as the sincerest form of flattery. So we're pleased when other parties borrow good policies from us. We have plenty more if they want them.
I'd like to just touch on the recent local elections. They were a bit of a win for the Greens. You did make gains where most parties made losses.
We almost tripled our number of councillors, you're right.
Indeed. Are you worried at all that you won't be able to replicate this on the EU level when in an election basically about Brexit, more major Remain parties like the Lib Dems and Change UK are standing against you?
Well, it's a good question. I think certainly in the South West we are the strongest positioned party, not just in terms of the fact that we actually have a sitting MEP who's done a fantastic job for the last 5 years, that's Molly Scott-Cato, but also I think in terms of our policies, they seem to be resonating with voters in a big way. I think things like Extinction Rebellion have raised people's awareness of climate change as a massive issue which needs to have something done about it very quickly. So I think the polls as well are showing that we're actually level with the Conservatives in the South West, which is quite an interesting development for the Greens. We could even overtake them. So I'm confident that we can return at least one Green MEP, the one we have already. We really want to get her back at the European Parliament because she's been doing fantastic work there. But we think we may have a chance of getting 2 elected, which would be even better.
As I've said, this election is largely centred around Brexit. Do you believe the result of the 2016 referendum to be legitimate?
Absolutely not, actually. And I've done a lot of research into exactly what was happening around the time of that referendum in terms of illegal funding, in terms of money coming in offshore from sources that are still unknown, in terms of massive breaches of personal data, Facebook data in particular, which were used to target voters in a way that to my mind was clearly illegal. Facebook itself has been fined the highest possible fine for some of those breaches. The National Crime Agency is still investigating some leading figures in that Brexit campaign, including Aaron Banks, who with Nigel Farage was heading up Leave.eu. So I think that result was obtained by illegitimate means.
Although opinion polls around the subject of Leave and Remain, which have been conducted after the referendum, are still showing that despite all the information that you've just talked about coming out, it's barely moved the needle. It may be 52-48 the other way.
No, you're quite wrong. I've been tracking opinion polls since June 2016, and I can say with certainty that for about, over 18 months, nearly 2 years, almost every opinion poll taken, possibly every one, there may be one exception, I think, but they've all shown that there has been a clear lead for people who say that they would vote Remain if they had the chance to do so again, and who now see Brexit as a mistake. So I think there's been a very significant shift in public opinion. And this, by the way, is a very different situation to the one just before the June 16 referendum. There were lots of opinion polls taken before then. They were all over the place. What we've seen over the last 2 years is a clear trend of people deciding that basically Brexit is a mistake. And I think it's not surprising because they've seen the incredible mess, the absolute chaos that has been caused as a result of the Brexit vote, and they don't like it.
Well, the South West, which you're standing for, voted narrowly to leave. Can you legitimately claim to be able to represent their interests while actively campaigning to prevent what they voted for?
Well, I'm part of a group called Cornwall for Europe, and over the last 18 months or so, I've been with them doing street stalls in literally every part of Cornwall. And what we've seen is that increasing numbers of people who voted Leave are now really quite angry because they know that they were lied to in June 2016. They can see that the promises that were made then were completely empty, and they have changed their minds. And I think they need to be given the chance to express what they see as the best way forward out of this complete mess.
When was it that these people's minds changed? Because there seemed to be a tremendous amount before 2016, a tremendous amount of popular will to have a referendum. The referendum result was to leave. The general election next year resulted in 80% of the population voting for parties who said they would leave the European Union. When did this change happen?
Well, I think people change their minds for different reasons. I mean, I can tell you, for example, about a crab fisherman who I met from Looe, who was, amongst the fishermen who are often used as the kind of poster boys for Brexit and are widely assumed to be gagging for Brexit. This guy said that he now realised that his business and his livelihood were at risk from Brexit, that he would not be able to export his catch as he does now to Spain without it going off because of all of the customs checks, all of the tariff barriers which would put the prices up as well for his Spanish customers. He would basically be put out of business by Brexit. In his case, that's what changed his mind. People have all sorts of different reasons, but I think probably the main reason is that a lot of people now realise how they personally will be affected by Brexit. It's not some kind of abstract notion. It's not just about big rhetorical words like sovereignty. It's about your job or your friend's job or somebody in your family whose job is at risk or who has already lost their job. And people have been losing jobs because of Brexit. And people in Cornwall and elsewhere are very well aware of this now.
Well, if, as you say, that the polls indicate that people now want to remain and that there has been this seismic shift in the will of the country towards remain, why are the Brexit Party so commandingly ahead in these EU election polls in every opinion poll done?
Well, it's a very unusual party because it has one very simple message, and that message is Brexit. It doesn't have any policies. All it has is a lot of angry rhetoric about Brexit and the people's will.
And still commands a lot of support, so it doesn't matter.
Well,
there is
a lot of support. I haven't seen. Can you tell me what the latest opinion polls show it at?
I pretty much every opinion poll I've seen has been the Brexit Party in first and Labour quite close behind in second.
I think that's because it is a single issue party, and there are not other parties with the same message, or at least there's only UKIP, which has basically become a kind of out-and-out fascist party and made itself so completely unattractive that it's not going to get any votes at all. The only function of UKIP, as far as I can see, is to kind of make the Brexit Party look good by comparison.
I do want to press this point, because you're saying they have no policies, they're just a single issue party, but they're still polling ahead of both the major parties and all the parties that say they want to remain in the EU.
Well, you've got to also take into account that there are several parties who have positioned themselves as anti-Brexit parties. So whatever you think about that, and of course they have different sets of other policies, but the anti-Brexit vote, if you see this election as essentially about Brexit, is split across several parties. So I think what's important to look at after this election is not the ranking of parties, but if you're interested in who's for or against Brexit, you look at the total number of votes for the parties which are clearly against Brexit. The Green Party is one of them, but of course there's also Change UK, there's also the Liberal Democrats, and the vote will be split across those parties.
But as you say, really there is only one party setting out the Brexit case.
Exactly, that's why it's so easy. That's why it is so easy for it to attract all of the votes of people who want Brexit.
Several parties for Remain. Is that really a fair fight, measuring the support for all those parties for whatever reason people may support them? Maybe someone's very concerned about climate change but is a Brexiteer and would vote Green. Is that necessarily a fair vote against leaving the EU?
I don't think anyone would be voting for the Green Party in this election, really, unless they were very solidly against Brexit. That's one of the main planks of our platform for this election. We've been leading the People's Vote campaign for the last 2.5 years. Caroline Lucas has been by far the most effective spokesman, or spokesperson I should say, for that campaign. So we are very much associated with the anti-Brexit People's Vote movement in this country, and people will be voting for us in large numbers. Not just for that reason, of course there will be other reasons, but very few people who actively wanted Brexit would be voting for the Green Party in this election.
Many of the Remain parties have said we should stay in the EU and reform it somewhat
Yes.
to address the concerns of Brexit voters. If that is what the Green Party want, which reforms would you like to see and how would you achieve them?
Well, I think there's quite a few reforms, and our Green MEP for the South West, Molly Scott-Cato, has been working on some of them very effectively. One of the things she's been working on, which I think is seriously important, is to reduce the role of corporate lobbyists at Brussels and Strasbourg. They have far too great a role in the way that EU policies are made at the moment, and there needs to be much greater transparency over that. So that's certainly something I'd like to see. I think farming policy, again, something which Molly has been working on, does need some reforms. It doesn't work in some cases very well at the moment. I think more of the subsidies that are currently paid, and it's a very large part of the EU budget, should be going for sort of environmental, the kind of work that farmers can do to improve the local environment rather than simply to increase food production. So there's lots of things which Greens can very usefully play a part in and have been doing.
But how do those reforms address the concerns of your average Leave voter, which are generally control of the lawmaking process, control of immigration?
Well, I talked to a lot of Leave voters. As I said, doing these stalls in Cornwall, we meet lots of Leave voters all the time, and that indeed is the kind of top concern of most people who voted Leave. A lot of them will say, I don't like all these laws that the EU is imposing on us. I often ask them, well, can you name me one law which the EU has made which you object to? And I have yet to come across one Leave voter who can name a single law that they actually object to in concrete terms. So I think partly this needs to be about better communication of the democratic process at European level, and it is a democratic institution. In some ways it's more democratic than our own parliamentary system, not least because there's a system of proportional representation for electing MEPs. So the MEPs for the South West better reflect the way people actually voted than I think the MPs who we sent to Westminster. So certainly we need to try and make that clearer. I think there's a huge problem in this country to do with education. I was never taught anything at school about either how our own parliamentary system works or about how the EU system works at all. And I think that's the case for pretty much everyone who goes through British schools. They simply don't learn about these things. And I think that really needs to change. It's not something that can be changed really at EU level. I'm not saying that the EU should dictate what happens in our classrooms. It doesn't do that at the moment, and it shouldn't do that in future. But I think we do need to make much more effort to educate people about how politics works. A lot of people really don't understand how it works either in our country or in the EU.
Well, that information is freely available, and speaking as someone who's done a politics A-level, that was taught in the British school system.
If you do a politics A-level, you'll know much more about it than most people.
So, really, you mentioned that the EU is a democratic institution, and maybe hinted that the concerns of Brexiteers over things like EU regulation aren't really well founded. What about a concern, for example, over a democratic deficit, in that there are laws that are made in the EU which affect this country, but our MEPs do not have full authority over making them?
Well, our MPs don't have full authority in one sense over making the laws here. Laws are made by the executive branch. In the European Union, at least they are proposed by that branch in the European Union, and that is the European Commission. The members of the Commission are appointed by national governments, who are, of course, democratically elected. When those laws are proposed, they have to go to the EU Parliament. The EU Parliament can suggest changes. It could refuse to vote them through. So it is a thoroughly democratic process, but it's a process that happens rather differently from the way it does at Westminster, and I think a lot of people don't understand it. So I certainly think that we need to do much more, and probably the EU itself does need to do more about explaining how that system works.
Tom Scott, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.